Dumbing us down, the hidden curriculum of compulsory schooling. Chapter 4. We need less school, not more. This essay, a personal favourite, was written especially for the first edition and presented many times as a public speech before the book was published. We were making the future, he said, and hardly any of us troubled to think what future we were making. And here it is. Sleeper awakes, H.G. Wells. A surprising number of otherwise sensible people find it hard to see why the scope and reach of our formal schooling networks should not be increased by extending the school day or year, for instance, in order to provide an economical solution to the problems posed by the decay of the American family. One reason for their preference, I think, is that they have trouble understanding the real difference between communities and networks, or even the difference between families and networks. Because of this confusion, they conclude that replacing a bad network with a good one is the right way to go. Since I disagree so strongly with the fundamental premise that networks are workable substitutes for families, and because from anybody's point of view a lot more school is going to cost a lot more money, I thought I'd tell you why, from a school teacher's perspective, we shouldn't be thinking of more school, but of less. People who admire our school institution usually admire networking in general, and have an easy time seeing its positive side, but they overlook its negative aspect. Networks, even good ones, drain the vitality from communities and families. They provide mechanical, by-the-numbers solutions to human problems, when a slow, organic process of self-awareness, self-discovery and cooperation is what is required if any solution is to stick. Think of the challenge of losing weight. It's possible to employ mechanical tricks to do this quickly, but I'm told that 95% of the poor souls who do are only fooling themselves. The weight lost this way doesn't stay off, it comes back in a short time. Other network solutions are just as temporary. A group of law students may network to pass their college exams, but preparing a brief in private practice is often a solitary, lonely experience. Aristotle saw a long time ago that fully participating in a complex range of human affairs was the only way to become fully human. In that, he differed from Plato. What is gained from consulting a specialist and surrendering all judgment is often more than outweighed by a permanent loss of one's own volition. This discovery accounts for the curious texture of real communication, where people argue with their doctors, lawyers and ministers, tell craftsmen what they want instead of accepting what they get, frequently make their own food from scratch instead of buying it in a restaurant or defrosting it, and perform many similar acts of participation. A real community is, of course, a collection of real families who themselves function in this participatory way. Networks, however, don't require the whole person, but only a narrow piece. If, on the other hand, you function in a network, it asks you to suppress all the parts of yourself except the network interest part, a highly unnatural act, although one you can get used to. In exchange, the network will deliver the efficiency in the pursuit of some limited aim. This is in fact a devil's bargain, since, on the promise of some future gain, one must surrender the wholeness of one's present humanity. If you enter into too many of these bargains, you will split yourself into many specialized pieces, none of them completely human. And no time is available to reintegrate them. This, ironically, is the destiny of many successful networkers and doubtless generates much business for divorce courts and therapists of a variety of persuasions. The fragmentation caused by excessive networking creates diminished humanity, a sense that our lives are out of control, because they are. If we face the present school and community crisis squarely, with hopes of finding a better way, we need to accept that schools as networks create a large part of the agony of modern life. We don't need more schooling, we need less. I expect you'll want some proof of that, even though the million or so people participating in education at home these days have begun to nibble at the edge of everybody's consciousness and promise to bite their way into national attention when details of their success get around a little more. So for those of you who haven't heard that you don't need officially certified teachers in officially certified schools to get a good education, let me try to expose some of the machinery that makes certified schooling so bad. And remember, if you're thinking, but it's always been that way, it really hasn't. Compulsory schooling in factory schools is a very recent, a very Massachusetts, New York development. Remember too that until 30 odd years ago, you could escape mass schooling after school. Now it is much harder to escape because another form of mass schooling, television, has spread all over the place to blot up any attention spared by school. So what was merely grotesque in our national treatment of the young before 1960 has become tragic now. Now that mass commercial entertainment, as addictive as any other hallucinogenic drug, has blocked the escape routes from mass schooling. It is a fact generally ignored when considering the communal nature of institutional families like schools, large corporations, colleges, armies, hospitals and government agencies that they are not real communities at all but networks. Unlike communities, networks, as I reminded you, have a very narrow way of allowing people to associate, and that way is always across a short spectrum of one or at most a few specific uniformities. In spite of ritual moments like the Christmas party or the office softball game, when individual human components in the network go home, they go home alone. And in spite of humanitarian support from fellow workers that eases emergencies, when people in networks suffer, they suffer alone, unless they have a family or communities to suffer with them. Even with college dorm communities, those most engaging and intimate simulations of community imaginable, who among us has not experienced the awful realization after graduation that we cannot remember our friends' names or faces very well, or who, if we can remember, feels much desire to renew those associations. It is a puzzling development, as yet poorly understood, that the caring in networks is in some important way feigned. Not maliciously, but in spite of any genuine emotional attractions that might be there, human behaviour in network situations often resembles a dramatic act, matching a script produced to meet the demands of a story. And as such, the intimate moments in networks lack the sustaining value of their counterparts in community. Those of you who remember the wonderful closeness possible in army camp life or sports teams, and who have now forgotten those you were once close with, will understand what I mean. In contrast, have you ever forgotten an uncle or an aunt? If the loss of true community entailed by masquerading in networks is not noticed in time, a condition arises in the victim's spirit very much like the trout starvation that used to strike wilderness explorers whose diet was made up exclusively of stream fish. While trout quell the pangs of hunger and even taste good, the eater gradually suffers for want of sufficient nutrients. Networks, like schools, are not communities, just as school training is not education. By preempting 50% of the total time of the young, by locking young people up with other young people exactly their own age, by ringing bells to start and stop work, by asking people to think about the same thing at the same time in the same way, by grading people the way we grade vegetables, and in a dozen other vile and stupid ways, network schools steal the vitality of communities and replace it with an ugly mechanism. No one survives these places with their humanity intact. Not kids, not teachers, not administrators, and not parents. A community is a place in which people face each other over time in all their human variety, good parts, bad parts, and all the rest. Such places promote the highest quality of life possible, lives of engagement and participation. This happens in unexpected ways, but it never happens when you've spent more than a decade listening to other people talk and trying to do what they tell you to do, trying to please them after the fashion of schools. It makes a real lifelong difference whether you avoid that training or it traps you. An example might clarify this. Networks of urban reformers will convene to consider the problems of homeless vagrants, but a community will think of its vagrants as real people, not abstractions. Ron, Dave or Marty. A community will call its bums by their names. It makes a difference. People interact on thousands of invisible pathways in a community, and the emotional payoff is correspondingly rich and complex. But networks can only manage a cartoon simulation of community and provide a very limited payoff. I belong to some networks myself, of course, but the only ones I consider completely safe are the ones that reject their communal facade, acknowledge their limits, and concentrate solely on helping me to do a specific and necessary task. But a vampire network like a school, which tears off huge chunks of time and energy needed for building community and family, and always asks for more, needs to have a stake driven through its heart and be nailed into its coffin. The feeding frenzy of formal schooling has already wounded us seriously in our ability to form families and communities by bleeding away time we need with our children and our children need with us. That's why I say we need less school, not more. Who can deny that networks can get some jobs done? They do, but they lack any ability to nourish their members emotionally. The extreme rationality at the core of networking is based on the same misperception of human nature the French Enlightenment and Comte were guilty of. At our best, we human beings are much, much grander than merely rational. At our best, we transcend rationality while incorporating its procedures into our lower levels of functioning. This is why computers will never replace people, for they are condensed to be rational and hence very limited. Networks divide people, first from themselves and then from each other, on the grounds that this is the efficient way to perform a task. It may well be, but it is a lousy way to feel good about being alive. Networks make people lonely. They cannot correct their inhuman mechanism and still succeed as networks. Behind the anomaly that networks look like communities but are not, lurks the grotesque secret of mass schooling, and the reason why enlarging the school domain would only aggravate the dangerous conditions of social disintegration it is intended to correct. I want to repeat this until you are sick of hearing it. Networks do great harm by appearing enough like real communities to create expectations that they can manage human social and psychological needs. The reality is that they cannot. Even associations as inherently harmless as bridge clubs, chess clubs, amateur acting groups, or groups of social activists will, if they remain a pretense of whole friendship, ultimately produce that odd sensation familiar to all city dwellers of being lonely in the middle of a crowd. Which of us who frequently networks has not felt this sensation? Belonging to many networks does not add up to having a community, no matter how many you belong to or how often your telephone rings. With a network, what you get at the beginning is all you ever get. Networks don't get better or worse. Their limited purpose keeps them pretty much the same all the time, as there just isn't much development possible. The pathological state which eventually develops out of these constant repetitions of thin human contact is a feeling that your friends and colleagues don't really care about you beyond what you can do for them. That they have no curiosity about the way you manage your life, no curiosity about your hopes, fears, victories, defeats. The real truth is that the friends falsely mourned for their indifference were never friends, just fellow networkers, from whom, in fairness, little should be expected beyond attention to the common interest. But given our unquenchable need for community and the unlikelihood of obtaining that community in a network, we are so desperate for any solution that we are driven to deceive ourselves about the nature of these liaisons. Whatever caring really means, it means something more than simple companionship or even the comradeship of shared interests. In the growth of human society, families came first, communities second, and only much later came the institutions set up by the community to serve it. Most institutional rhetoric, the proclaiming of what is important, borrows its values from those of individual families that work well together. Particularly over the past century and a half in the United States, spokesmen for institutional life have demanded a role above and beyond service to families and communities. They have sought to command and prescribe as kings used to do, though there is an important difference. In the case of ancient kings, once beyond the range of their voices and trumpets, you could usually do what you pleased. But in the case of modern institutions, the reach of technology is everywhere. There is no escape if the place where you live and the family you live in cannot provide sanctuary. Institutions, say their political philosophers, are better at creating marching orders for the human race than families are. Therefore, they should no longer be expected to follow but should lead. Institutional leaders have come to regard themselves as great synthetic fathers to millions of synthetic children, by which I mean to all of us. This theory sees us bound together in some abstract family relationship in which the state is the true mother and father. Hence, it insists on our first and best loyalty. Ask not, said President Kennedy, what your country can do for you, but rather ask what you can do for your country. Since the you in question is both real and human, and the country you are alleged to possess is one of the most extreme of verbal abstractions, it will readily be seen that the President's injunction is an expression of a synthetic family philosophy, which regards nation as possessing a claim superior to the claim of family. If you see nothing wrong with this, then it is probable you also believe that, with a little tinkering, our schools will work just fine. But if you have a queer feeling about the image of yourself and your family as appendages of an abstraction, then we are on the same wavelength. In the latter case, we are ready to consider that we may need less school, not more. I want to examine the destructive effects the false claim of institutional prerogative has on both individual and family life. A destructiveness equally profound whether the claim comes from a government, a corporation, or some other form of network. If we return to our original discussion of networks, it will be clear that every one of our national institutions is a place where men, women and children are isolated according to some limited aspect of their total humanity, by age and a few other considerations in the case of compulsory schooling, as well as by various other sorting mechanisms in the other institutional arenas. If performance within these narrow confines is conceived to be the supreme measure of success, if, for instance, an A average is considered the central purpose of adolescent life, the requirements for which take most of the time and attention of the aspirant, and if the worth of the individual is reckoned by victory or defeat in this abstract pursuit, then a social machine has been constructed which, by attaching purpose and meaning to essentially meaningless and fantastic behavior, will certainly dehumanize students, alienate them from their own human nature, and break the natural connection between them and their parents, to whom they would otherwise look for significant affirmations. Welcome to the world of mass schooling, which sets this goal as its supreme achievement. Are you sure we want more of it? As we approach the 21st century, it is correct to say that the United States has become a nation of institutions, whereas it used to be a nation of communities. Large cities have great difficulty supporting healthy community life, partly because of the coming and going of strangers, partly because of space constrictions, partly because of poisoned environments, but mostly because of the constant competition of institutions and networks for the custody of children and old people, for monopolizing the time of everyone else in between. By isolating young and old from the working life of places, and by isolating the working population from the lives of young and old, institutions and networks have brought about a fundamental disconnection of the generations. The griefs that arise from this have no synthetic remedy. No vibrant, satisfying communities can come into being where young and old are locked away. Here and there, mutilated versions of community struggle to survive, as in places where cultural homogeneity has been fiercely protected, such as in Bensonhurst in Brooklyn or Polish Hill in Pittsburgh. But in the main, community in cities and suburbs is a thin illusion, confined to simulated events like street festivals. If you have moved from one neighbourhood to another or from one suburb to another and have quickly forgotten the friends you left behind, then you will have experienced the phenomenon I refer to. Over 90% of the United States population now lives inside 50 urban aggregations. Having been concentrated there as the end product of fairly well understood historical processes, they are denied a reciprocal part in any continuous, well articulated community. They are profoundly alienated from their own human interests. What else could it mean that only half of our eligible citizens are registered to vote? And that of those, a barely 50% do vote. In two-party jurisdictions, a trifle over 1/8 of the citizenry is thus sufficient to elect public officials, assuming the vote splits fairly even. We've come a long way down the road to redefining as an option what used to be regarded as a duty. But that is what alienation from community life quickly accomplishes: indifference to almost everything. When one is offered institutional simulations of community, a steady diet of networks, involuntary like schools, or voluntary like isolated workplaces divorced from human variety, basic human needs are placed in the gravest jeopardy, a danger magnified many times in the case of children. Institutional goals, however sane and well-intentioned, are unable to harmonize deeply with the uniqueness of individual human goals. No matter how good the individuals who manage an institution are, institutions lack a conscience because they measure by accounting methods. Institutions are not the sum total of their personnel or even of their leadership, but are independent of both and will exist after management has been completely replaced. They are ideas come to life, ideas in whose service all employees are but servo mechanisms. The deepest purposes of these gigantic networks are to regulate and to make uniform. Since the logic of family and community is to give scope to variety around a central theme, whenever institutions intervene significantly in personal affairs, they cause much damage. By redirecting the focus of our lives from families and communities to institutions and networks, we in effect anoint a machine our king. Nearly a century ago, a French sociologist wrote that every institution's unstated first goal is to survive and grow, not to undertake the mission it has nominally staked out for itself. Thus, the first goal of a government postal service is not to deliver the mail. It is to provide protection for its employees and perhaps a modest status ladder for the more ambitious ones. The first goal of a permanent military organisation is not to defend national security, but to secure in perpetuity a fraction of the national wealth to distribute to its personnel. It was this Philistine potential that teaching the young for pay would inevitably expand into an institution for the protection of teachers, not students, that made Socrates condemn the sophists so strongly long ago in ancient Greece. If this view of things troubles you, think of the New York City public school system in which I work, one of the largest business organizations on planet Earth. While the education administered by this abstract parent is ill-regarded by everybody, the institution's right to compel its clientele to accept such dubious service is still guaranteed by the police, and forces are gathering to expand its reach still further in the face of every evidence that it has been a disaster throughout its history. What gives the atmosphere of remote country towns and other national backwaters a peculiarly heady quality of fundamental difference is not simply a radical change of scenery from city or suburb, but the promise offered of near freedom from institutional intervention in family life. Big Father doesn't watch over such places closely. Where his presence is felt most is still in the schools, which even there grind out their relentless message of anger, envy, competition and caste verification in the form of grades and classes. But a home life and community exist there as antidotes to the poison. The business we call education, when we mean schooling, makes an interesting example of network values in conflict with traditional community values. For 150 years, institutional education has seen fit to offer as its main purpose the preparation for economic success. Good education equals good job. Good money, good things. This has become the universal national banner, hoisted by Harvards as well as high schools. This prescription makes both parent and student easier to regulate and intimidate as long as the connection goes unchallenged, either for its veracity or in its philosophical truth. Interestingly enough, the American Federation of Teachers identifies one of its missions as persuading the business community to hire and promote on the basis of school grades, so that the grades equal money formula will obtain. Grades equals money formula will obtain, just as it was made to obtain for medicine and law after years of political lobbying. So far, the common sense of business people has kept them hiring and promoting the old-fashioned way, using performance and private judgment as the preferred measures, but they may not resist much longer. The absurdity of defining education as an economic good becomes clear if we ask ourselves what is gained by perceiving education as a way to enhance even further the runaway consumption that threatens the earth, the air, and the water of our planet. Should we continue to teach people that they can buy happiness in the face of a tidal wave of evidence that they cannot? Shall we ignore the evidence that drug addiction, alcoholism, Teenage suicide, divorce, and other despairs are pathologies of the prosperous much more than they are of the poor. On this question of meanings we've hidden from ourselves for so long, hangs both an understanding of the illness that is killing us and the cure we are searching for. What, after all this time, is the purpose of mass schooling supposed to be? Reading, writing, and arithmetic can't be the answer, because properly approached, these things take less than 100 hours to transmit, and we have abundant evidence that each is readily self-taught in the right setting and time. Why then are we locking kids up in an involuntary network with strangers for 12 years? Surely not so a few of them can get rich. Even if it worked that way, and I doubt that it does, why wouldn't any sane community look on such an education as positively wrong? It divides and classifies people, demanding that they compulsively compete with each other, and publicly labels the losers by literally degrading them, identifying them as low-class material. And the bottom line for the winners is that they can buy more stuff. I don't believe that anyone who thinks about that feels comfortable with such a silly conclusion. I can't help feeling that if we could only answer the question of what it is that we want from these kids we lock up, we would suddenly see where we took a wrong turn. I have enough faith in American imagination and resourcefulness to believe that at that point we'd come up with a better way. In fact, a whole supermarket of better ways. One thing I do know though, most of us who've had a taste of loving families, even a little taste, want our kids to be part of one. One other thing I know is that eventually you have to come to be part of a place, part of its hills and streets and waters and people, or you will live a very, very sorry life as an exile forever. Discovering meaning for yourself, as well as discovering satisfying purpose for yourself, is a big part of what education is. How can this be done by locking children away from the world is beyond me. An important difference between communities and institutions is that communities have natural limits. They stop growing or they die. There's a good reason for this. In the best communities, everyone is a special person who sooner or later impinges on everyone else's consciousness. The effects of this constant attention make all, rich or poor, feel important, because the only way importance is perceived is by having other folks pay attention to you. You can buy attention, of course, but it's not the same thing. Pseudo community life, where you live around others without noticing them, and where you are constantly being menaced in some way by strangers you find offensive, is exactly the opposite. In pseudo community life, you are anonymous for the most part, and you want to be because of various dangers other people may present if they notice your existence. Almost the only way you can get attention in a pseudo community is to buy it, because the prevailing atmosphere is one of indifference. A pseudo community is just a different kind of network. Its friendships and loyalties are transient. Its problems are universally considered to be someone else's problems, someone else who should be paid to solve them. Its young and old are largely regarded as annoyances, and the most commonly shared dream is to get out to a better place, to trade up endlessly. Unlike true communities, pseudo communities and other comprehensive networks like schools expand indefinitely, just as long as they can get away with it. More may not be better, but more is always more profitable for the people who make a living out of the networking. That is what is happening today behind the cry to expand schooling even further. A great many people are going to make a great deal of money if growth can be continued. Unlike the intricate, sometimes unfathomable satisfactions of community life and family life, the successes of networks are always measured in mathematical displays of one-upmanship. How many years? How much weight loss? How many inquiries generated? Competition is the network's lifeblood, and the precision suggested by the numerical rankings of performance is its preferred style. The quality competition of businesses, when it actually happens, is generally a good thing for customers. It keeps businesses on their toes, doing their best. The competition inside an institution like a school isn't the same thing at all. What is competed for in a school is the favour of a teacher, and that can be won or lost by too many subjective parameters to count. It is always a little arbitrary and sometimes a lot more pernicious than that. It gives rise to envy, dissatisfaction, and a belief in magic. Teachers too must compete for the arbitrarily dispensed favour of administrators, which carries the promise of good or bad classes, good or bad rooms, access to or denial of tools, and other hostages to obedience, deference, and subordination. The culture of schools only coheres in response to a web of material rewards and punishments. A's, F's, bathroom passes, gold stars, good classes, access to a photocopy machine. Everything we know about why people drive themselves to know things and do their best is contradicted inside these places.